kind of like fighting in Vietnam. You don't know who to trust when and where and why. Okay, but the Albany Plan was not acceptable to the colonies or to the British government, and the government decided to rely on sending small detachments of regulars to help the colonists secure their frontiers. So we're just going to get a detachment of 20 or 50 or 100 regulars in our town. When the French responded by embarking 3,000 of their own regulars for Canada, right? You're sending regulars there, we'll send regulars there, because they're after them. French are the ones arming the Indians. So it escalates now. The British say, you're going to arm the Indians, we'll send troops. The French say, you're going to send troops, we're going to send troops. They send 3,000 over. At that point, the French and Indian War quickly became more than a contest between European colonists and Indian allies, and by the summer of 1755, the British and French warships had fought off Newfoundland, and Anglo-American forces had both conquered Acadia, deporting most of the French population, and suffered a dramatic defeat along the banks of the Monongahela in western Pennsylvania, a river in western Pennsylvania. The early appearance of regular British forces, it says that the early appearance of the British forces didn't mean that the British government necessarily supported the colonists' war aims, which were, as we've seen, rather tenaciously holding on to land and new conquests and stuff, taking new territory and keeping it. And sort of like ever expanding. They were just thought, we'll just take land from the worthless savages. So, they didn't necessarily support the colonists' aims. By 1755, many leading English colonists had begun to dream of conquering French and Spanish lands in North America. Conquer the whole damn thing. They had learned in more than half a century of conflict to hate their Catholic neighbors and to fear their sudden incursions on frontier settlements. Again and again, as we've seen before, I think it was the French who wanted to constantly attack and raid various places along the frontier to keep the English from doing any large massive attacks. You keep them busy all the time with never knowing what's coming where, and they'll never have the time to mount a large attack. What that does is it builds up steam in the British system, and it's going to blow up on the French. Whatever. So they fear this. They start to really hate this sort of terrorism. Your town all of a sudden is just flooded with Frenchmen and Indians attacking and shooting people, and then they all run. They had also come to see that the French and Spanish and their Indian allies were obstacles to the growing English population. The French population was static. Oh, I'm sure it was growing. I'm sure it was growing. But let's say it grows 50%. That's not even adding close to as many people as the British if the British grow 5%, you know. So the French and Spanish are not growing, certainly not at the speed of the English. And it doesn't look like it's going to change in any way. It's probably just lucky people that were able to get into the French and Spanish systems, and the English system was a freer and more open system, open to more people, just about anybody. Any worthless punk who could get, who would sign their thing saying they'd worked for 7 years in North America could get their passage paid by the companies and stuff. So anyways, very different sides of this, and the French and Spanish were alarmed by the growing English population. Now it says the British also came to see that they restricted, the French and Spanish and their Indian allies restricted access to the rich lands of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, as well as their trade with Indians. So on some level, the British want to be able to trade with the Indians, but the Indians are being constantly corrupted and hired as mercenaries and turned against the British. Maybe there'd be some level on which they could get along with some of the Indian bands, but it's just turned into a conundrum for them. And here's the Indians and the French and their non-productive trappers and stuff that are just taking, not living off the land in any British sort of way, but just sort of harvesting, if you will, what nature's able to produce, not improving. Now, that later on came to be a standard of whether or not the land was yours in the Wild West. You couldn't just claim the land. Did you improve it? Because if someone came and improved it, put up a ditch and fence and crops and a cabin, that was a real claim to land in the Wild West. Okay, and they couldn't get access to the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. They knew about them. They wanted to be able to move there and strike out on their own and claim 80 acres out of the middle of nowhere and them and their sons defend it with muskets. They wanted to be able to do it. But these damn Indians, French and Spanish, To end threats to their frontiers and to open the West to speculators, settlers, and traders, the English colonists needed to do more than haggle with the French and Spanish over existing frontiers. They needed to conquer the French and Spanish colonists and expel them from North America. Some people want this called ethnic cleansing today, or population transfer is called in World War II. Expel them, much as they had conquered and expelled the Indians from the Atlantic seaboard. So they had precedent. They had done it once. That's where they lived. The area they lived in safely was Indian free. Let's keep pushing. The British government would be slow to support or even comprehend these war aims. The government would not declare war on France until May 1756, or consider conquering New France until William Pitt became the King's principal minister in December of 1756. Until then, the British would wage a limited frontier war, while the colonists dreamed of conquest. Remember, sending just a few detachments to this and that town. Although the colonists had more ambitious war aims than the British government, and appealed to the government to help fight their war, they were most uncooperative and ineffective allies. The government did expect the colonists to provide recruits and provisions for the British regiments, as well as provisional forces to support the regulars. So as the regulars decreased in number from disease and battle, they were supposed to be recruited from the population of the colonists. And, more than that, colonists were supposed to have provisional forces to help support the recruits from Britain. But when in the summer of 1756 British generals arrived to take control of the war, they found the colonists not just unwilling to help recruit men for regular units, but opposed to having provincials serve under regular officers. So they didn't even want to put their, the men that they had under the control of the British commanders, because they didn't like the way the British commanders were going to fight. They thought, why should we let you tell us what to do in these battles? You don't know what to do. You're British, stupid British. We live with these Indians. We know how the French fight. We know how the British or the Spanish and no, we're not going to let you control our men during battles. Ridiculous. And pissed the British off. That made the British mad. Colonial assemblies, eager to assert their independence of royal authority, had forbidden provincials to submit to British orders or military justice. And the provincials, having contracted to serve only under their own officers, would have deserted rather than accept British direction. Now it brings up desertion there. If their commanders do say, okay, we're accepting British orders, a lot of the men would desert. Fine. And here are the British soldiers in the middle of this land of freedom, and do you think the British soldiers were deserting? Yeah, there were British soldiers that deserted. Similarly, the colonists refused to let the British take charge of their systems of supply, or to quarter troops at their expense without the approval of the colonial assemblies. To gain the cooperation of the colonists in prosecuting the war, the British commander-in-chief, the Earl of Loudon, agreed to keep regulars and provincials apart, and to let the provincials serve under their own officers, who would rank after the British majors. Even so, with the exception of New York, the colonies rarely satisfied Loudon's request for men, supplies, transportation, and quarters in the campaign of 1756 and 57. Those provincials who did come forward were fit mainly for fatigue and garrison duty, not the very best soldiers. They were too poorly trained to be steady under fire, poorly trained, or value their lives too highly, and too undisciplined to maintain their health in camp. Too undisciplined? That's must be a myth that was bandied about by the British elite or something like that. That a well-organized and maintained army has less disease and filth and stuff. Hogwash. Hogwash. Why does this army die more of disease than that army died less of disease? Because this army was less ordered. They didn't have good discipline. Oh shit. Keep discipline in my army. Alright, Britain takes control of the war. In large part because the colonists were such ineffective and